I never thought the sound of my own footsteps would become foreign to me. But at 73, walking through my own home felt like trespassing. The floorboards that had once welcomed my children's laughter now seemed to hold their breath whenever I passed, as if afraid to disturb the careful choreography of my diminished existence. For 37 years, I had lived in this house with my daughter and her family. What began as a temporary arrangement after my husband's death had stretched into decades of me becoming smaller and smaller, my presence condensed to the margins of their lives like footnotes in someone else's story. I had convinced myself this was natural, the way of things. Children grow up, start families, and parents fade into the background. But there's a difference between fading and being erased, though it took me far too long to understand that distinction. The morning everything changed started like any other. I woke at 5:30, as I had for the past decade, careful not to make noise, as I dressed in the small bedroom that had once been my husband's study. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now lived surrounded by his books while feeling increasingly illiterate in the language of my own family. I made my way to the kitchen, stepping lightly on the stairs I had once bounded up, two at a time when this was my house, when I was the mother instead of the burden. I prepared breakfast as I always did, setting out 4 plates even though I rarely joined them at the table anymore. My daughter had made it clear months ago that my slow eating and tendency to repeat stories was disruptive to their morning routine. So I ate standing at the counter, watching through the window as the neighbor's cat stalked through the garden I was no longer allowed to tend because my arthritis made me too slow, too inefficient. The family descended like a small storm system. My daughter moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her husband barely acknowledging my presence with his usual grunt, while my 2 teenage grandchildren grabbed food without a word. This was our dance, performed daily with the precision of a well-rehearsed play where I had been relegated to a walk-on role in my own home. That particular morning, my grandson needed lunch money. $20, he said, holding out his hand with the casual expectation of someone who had never been denied. My daughter was rushing around, gathering papers for work, her husband already in the car, honking impatiently. Without thinking, I reached for my purse and handed over the money, just as I had countless times before. But something in his expression as he pocketed the bill caught my attention. Not gratitude, not even acknowledgement, just the blank entitlement of someone taking what they believed was owed to them. Later that day, while organizing my small dresser, I found my notebook where I kept track of these small expenses. The pages told a story I hadn't fully grasped until I saw it laid out in my careful handwriting. Lunch money, gas money, emergency funds for car repairs, contributions to family vacations I wasn't invited on, money for school supplies, sports equipment, dates, and countless other requests that had become demands over the years. The numbers swam before my eyes, not because of my aging vision, but because of what they represented. I had been giving away pieces of my Social Security check, my small savings, my deceased husband's life insurance money, month after month, year after year, not out of generosity that was appreciated, but out of fear. Fear that saying no would make me even more unwelcome in this house that legally still belonged to me but emotionally had been claimed by others long ago. The next morning brought an incident that would crystallize everything. I had made pancakes, a special breakfast I thought might bring some warmth to our increasingly cold mornings together. I set the table carefully, using the good plates, and called the family down with something approaching excitement. Perhaps this would be the moment we could sit together, share a meal, reconnect as a family. My daughter appeared first, already dressed for work, moving with that hurried energy that had become her permanent state. She glanced at the table, and her face immediately shifted into annoyance. Why had I made such a mess? She wanted to know. They didn't have time for a sit-down breakfast. Didn't I understand they had schedules to keep? Her husband nodded agreement from the doorway, checking his phone with practiced indifference. But it was my grandson's reaction that cut deepest. He looked at the carefully arranged table, at the pancakes I had made from scratch, at my hopeful face, and rolled his eyes with theatrical disgust. "These aren't even the frozen ones he liked," he announced to no one in particular. Why did I always have to make things complicated? He grabbed a granola bar from the pantry and headed for the door, leaving me standing there with syrup still warm on the stove and something cold spreading through my chest. My daughter didn't scold him. She didn't acknowledge my effort or his rudeness. She simply grabbed her coffee and followed him out, calling over her shoulder that I should probably clean up before I went to my doctor's appointment, as if the mess was mine alone, as if the effort had been some selfish indulgence rather than an attempt to nurture the people I loved most in the world. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after they left, looking at the untouched pancakes growing cold on plates I had arranged with such care. The silence felt different than usual, heavier somehow, pregnant with realizations I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't a family going through a rough patch. This was a system that had learned to function by making me invisible, by treating my contributions as expectations and my needs as inconveniences. The doctor's appointment that afternoon became a catalyst I hadn't expected. My physician, a kind woman who had been caring for me for years, noticed something different in my demeanor. During the routine examination, she asked gentle questions about my living situation, my stress levels, my overall happiness. Perhaps it was the clinical setting, the neutral space where I could speak without fear of being overheard. But I found myself telling her things I had never said aloud before. I told her about feeling like a stranger in my own home, about the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, about how my opinions were dismissed or ignored, how my stories were met with sighs and eye rolls, how my physical limitations were treated as personal failings rather than natural parts of aging. I told her about the money, the constant small demands that had drained not just my savings but my sense of worth. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before asking a question that changed everything. She asked me when I had last felt truly happy, truly valued, truly at home in my own life. I couldn't answer her. The silence stretched between us as I searched my memory for moments of genuine contentment, for times when I felt like more than a convenient solution to someone else's problems. The absence of such memories was more damning than any confrontation could have been. Meanwhile, at home, my absence that afternoon apparently caused some inconvenience. When I returned, I found my daughter waiting with barely contained irritation. Where had I been? She wanted to know. She had tried calling, but I hadn't answered my phone. Did I realize my grandson had needed a ride home from school? Did I understand that she had to leave work early to handle something I was supposed to take care of? The accusations came in a familiar wave, each one designed to reinforce my role as the family's unpaid, on-call service provider. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual surge of guilt and apologetic explanations, I felt a strange calm settling over me. The doctor's question echoed in my mind, creating space between her words and my automatic responses. I apologized, as expected, but part of me remained detached, observing the interaction as if from outside myself. I watched my daughter's performance of victimhood, saw how she positioned my normal human needs as betrayals of my family obligations. I noticed how her frustration seemed disproportionate to the minor inconvenience of arranging alternative transportation for her 17-year-old son, who had been driving for over a year. The next several days passed in a strange suspension. I continued my usual routines, but with a new awareness that made everything feel different. I noticed how my contributions to household expenses were accepted without acknowledgement, while my use of common spaces was met with subtle sighs and rearrangements. I observed how family conversations flowed around me as if I were furniture, present, but not truly seen or heard. More importantly, I began to see patterns I had previously dismissed as temporary stresses or normal family dynamics. The way my daughter spoke to me in front of her children, setting an example of disrespect that they eagerly followed. The way my physical needs were treated as inconveniences rather than normal aspects of aging that required accommodation and understanding. The way my emotional needs were simply invisible, as if my feelings were less valid because of my age and dependence. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. Instead, it felt like waking up very slowly from a long dream, consciousness returning piece by piece until I could no longer pretend I was still asleep. I began keeping a journal, not of expenses this time, but of interactions, patterns, feelings I had been trained to suppress or ignore. I wrote about the morning my daughter cleaned around me as I sat in the living room, moving my coffee cup and book with exaggerated care while sighing loudly about all the things she had to do. I wrote about how my grandson asked for $50 for a school trip while scrolling through his phone, never making eye contact, treating me like an ATM that occasionally required the inconvenience of spoken requests. But I also wrote about older memories, from before I had learned to make myself small. I remembered hosting holiday dinners in this same house, commanding attention and respect as the family matriarch. I remembered my husband's pride in my cooking, my gardening, my ability to make our home a place people wanted to gather. I remembered feeling useful, needed, loved, rather than merely tolerated. The contrast was stark and painful, but also illuminating. I hadn't always been this diminished version of myself. I had allowed this reduction gradually, making accommodations and excuses until I had become complicit in my own erasure. The realization was humbling but also strangely empowering. If I had participated in creating this situation, perhaps I could also participate in changing it. The catalyst for action came on a Tuesday evening in late October. My daughter announced at dinner that they were planning a family vacation for Thanksgiving, a long weekend at a resort her husband's company had recommended. She spoke with excitement about the amenities, the restaurants, the activities they could enjoy as a family. It sounded wonderful, and for a moment, I felt genuine happiness for their opportunity to reconnect and relax. Then she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they would need me to pay for my own room since the family room they had booked only accommodated 4 people. The cost she quoted was more than my monthly Social Security check, money I didn't have after months of contributing to various family expenses. But more than the financial impossibility was the casual assumption that I would want to spend my limited resources to hover at the edges of their family bonding time. I asked, quietly, if they had considered that I might want to celebrate Thanksgiving in my own way, perhaps with old friends I rarely saw anymore, because family obligations had taken precedence. The suggestion was met with immediate resistance. This was family time, my daughter explained with the patience of someone addressing a confused child. I should want to be with family. Her tone suggested that any alternative preference on my part was not just selfish but slightly unnatural. But what stung most was my grandson's response. He looked up from his phone long enough to comment that it would probably be better if I didn't come anyway, since I would just complain about the food and need help with everything and slow them down like always. His casual cruelty, delivered without malice but with total indifference to its impact, crystallized something that had been building for months. My daughter didn't correct him. Her husband chuckled, as if the observation was merely astute rather than heartlessly dismissive. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I had become the problem they were trying to solve, the burden they were learning to manage, with decreasing grace and patience. That night, I sat in my small bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of my previous life. Photographs of happier times, books I had loved, small treasures that had once seemed important. I felt like an archaeologist, examining artifacts from a civilization that no longer existed. trying to remember what it had felt like to be the person who had collected these things with joy and purpose. I made a decision that night, not in anger or desperation, but with a clarity that surprised me. I would not continue to fund my own diminishment. I would not continue to accept crumbs of attention and call it love. I would not continue to pretend that this arrangement was working for anyone, including the family members who had grown comfortable with my silent subsidizing of their lives. The next morning, I called my doctor's office and asked for a referral to a social worker who specialized in senior services. I had resources I had forgotten about, options I had never considered because I had been so focused on trying to make an impossible situation work. Within a week, I was sitting across from a competent, compassionate professional who listened to my story without judgment and helped me understand my choices. I learned about assisted living communities that fostered independence rather than dependence. I learned about social programs that could help me maintain my home if I chose to live alone. I learned about legal protections for seniors and resources for those who had been financially exploited by family members. Most importantly, I learned that my situation was neither unique nor permanent, that other people had found ways to age with dignity and purpose, even when their families had failed them. Meanwhile, my behavior at home began to change in small but noticeable ways. When my grandson asked for lunch money, I suggested he speak to his parents about budgeting for his expenses. When my daughter assigned me household tasks that were physically difficult, I politely declined and suggested alternatives. When family discussions excluded me, I stopped pretending not to notice and began excusing myself, rather than sitting silently while conversations flowed around me. The pushback was immediate and intense. My daughter accused me of becoming difficult, stubborn, selfish in my old age. How could I be so ungrateful after everything they had done for me? Didn't I understand how hard it was to manage a household and career while also taking care of an elderly parent? Her husband nodded along, occasionally adding observations about how much easier their lives had been before I became so demanding. But the most revealing reaction came when I announced I would not be contributing to family expenses beyond my fair share of utilities and groceries. The explosion of outrage was educational. Suddenly I learned about all the ways my financial contributions had been integrated into their budget, how my money had been paying for luxuries they had reframed as necessities, how my Social Security had been subsidizing a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford on their own incomes. The mask slipped completely when my daughter demanded to know what I planned to do with my money if I wasn't going to help my own family. The possessive pronoun was telling. In her mind, my resources belonged to them by right of relationship, and my desire to control my own finances was a form of theft. I remained calm during these confrontations, a response that seemed to frustrate them more than anger would have. I had learned from the social worker that emotional manipulation often escalated when initial attempts failed, and I was prepared for the cycle of accusations, guilt trips, and threats that followed my new boundaries. They tried involving other family members, painting me as ungrateful and selfish to anyone who would listen. But I had also learned to tell my own story, to speak honestly about years of financial and emotional exploitation disguised as family harmony. Some relatives were shocked to learn about the extent of my contributions to the household and the conditions under which I had been living. Others preferred to stay out of what they saw as an internal family matter, but their neutral responses were at least honest, rather than manipulative. The breakthrough came when I announced my decision to move to an assisted living community I had toured and fallen in love with. The facility offered independence with support, social activities with people my own age, and most importantly, an environment where my presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. The decision wasn't made in anger but in hope, a choice toward a future that included dignity and purpose. My daughter's reaction revealed the true nature of our relationship more clearly than any conversation had. She was furious, not because she would miss me, but because she would miss my financial contributions and unpaid services. Her primary concerns were practical rather than emotional. Who would help with transportation for her son? Who would contribute to the household expenses? Who would be available for emergency babysitting and household management? The absence of any acknowledgement of what I might gain from the move, any curiosity about my happiness or well-being, was both painful and liberating. It confirmed what I had suspected, but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. I had become a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be loved, and my value to the family was entirely utilitarian. The moving process was both heartbreaking and healing. Sorting through decades of accumulated possessions, I found myself dividing my life into what mattered and what had simply accumulated. I kept photographs that brought joy rather than obligation, books that still spoke to me, small treasures that carried genuinely happy memories. The rest I donated or gave away, creating space for a simpler but more authentic existence. My new home was a revelation. The staff treated residents with respect and genuine care, understanding that aging brought challenges, but not diminished worth. My neighbors were people with rich histories and continuing interests, individuals who had chosen this community as a positive step rather than a last resort. Meals were social occasions rather than solitary necessities. Activities were opportunities for engagement rather than disruptions to be tolerated. Most importantly, I discovered that I was still capable of forming new friendships, pursuing interests I had abandoned, contributing meaningfully to a community that valued my participation. The woman who had felt invisible and burdensome in her own family home found herself appreciated and included in this new environment. The relationship with my daughter didn't end completely, but it transformed into something more honest, if less frequent. She occasionally visited, usually when she needed something, but the power dynamic had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer dependent on her approval or frightened of her displeasure. I could engage with her as an adult, choosing to maintain a relationship rather than as a supplicant grateful for whatever attention she was willing to provide. My grandson, now in college, began to reach out independently, perhaps recognizing that his previous behavior had been influenced by his parents' modeling rather than reflecting his true feelings. These conversations were tentative but genuine, and I found myself able to love him without enabling his sense of entitlement. Our relationship had the possibility of growth in ways that hadn't been possible within the toxic dynamics of the family home. Looking back, I understand that my years of silent endurance hadn't been virtuous patience, but harmful, enabling. By accepting treatment that diminished my worth, I had taught my family to value me less. By prioritizing their comfort over my dignity, I had created a system that served no one well, including the family members who had learned to see me as an obligation rather than a gift. The assisted living community has given me more than comfortable housing and convenient services. It has given me back my sense of agency, my right to make choices about my own life, my understanding that aging doesn't require accepting mistreatment disguised as care. I wake each morning in a space that is truly mine, surrounded by people who see me as a whole person rather than a collection of inconvenient needs. I have also discovered that financial independence, even on a fixed income, provides a kind of freedom I had forgotten existed. When my resources belong to me, I can make choices based on my values rather than others' expectations. I can be generous when I choose to be rather than when I'm pressured to be. I can say no without losing my place in someone else's life, because I have created a life that belongs entirely to me. The most surprising discovery has been the return of joy. Simple pleasures I had forgotten became possible again. Reading without interruption, gardening in the community plots where my efforts are appreciated rather than criticized, joining clubs and activities where my contributions are valued, making friends who choose my company rather than tolerate my presence. These seem like small things, perhaps, but they represent a fundamental shift from surviving to thriving. I had spent so many years accepting less and less that I had forgotten what it felt like to have enough, to be enough, to choose my own path forward. The guilt that had defined so many of my decisions gradually faded as I understood that protecting my own well-being didn't make me selfish, but rather made me available for genuine relationships rather than exploitative ones. The family members who truly cared about me supported my decision to prioritize my happiness. Those who objected revealed their own motivations more clearly than any confrontation could have. Today, at 75, I live in a small apartment that reflects my tastes and needs, rather than accommodating others' preferences. I have enough money to meet my needs and small wants because I'm no longer subsidizing other people's lifestyles. I have friends who enjoy my company and value my perspective. I have activities that engage my mind and hobbies that bring me pleasure. Most importantly, I have reclaimed my right to matter. My feelings are valid. My needs are legitimate. My boundaries are reasonable. My choices are my own to make. These seem like basic human rights, but I had gradually surrendered them all in the name of family harmony and filial duty. The woman who once made herself smaller and smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant for her has learned to expand again, to take up the room she deserves, to speak with the voice that had been silenced by years of dismissal and disregard. I am no longer anyone's burden or anyone's solution. I am simply myself, finally and completely, and that turns out to be more than enough.